The last chapter of your dissertation or thesis is commonly titled Summary and Discussion. An older style uses the title Conclusions and Recommendations. The title of the chapter will vary by university and their expectations. Some universities do not have their students think about the limitations and the implications of their study and recommendations for research. So you'll see a summary of the findings as well as the discussion relayed back to the theoretical framework and previous literature. Most of the dissertations and theses I see at Utah State University include the recommendations, thinking about the implications for their field and how people can use that information for practice, as well as recommendations for future research. The title of Chapter 5 for a thesis or dissertation in the ASTE department varies from discussion, recommendations, or conclusions and recommendations. Check with your committee chair on an appropriate chapter title. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to identify the components included in a discussion chapter. You'll recall all of the elements you should and should not include in the discussion of your conclusions and findings, and then discuss what to include in the recommendations section. Your sections for Chapter 5 will vary, but most commonly will include your chapter overview, your summary of your study, discussions of findings and results, the limitations, implications for practice, and recommendations for future research. The discussion or summary is often optional. For a chapter overview, you typically provide 1 to 2 paragraphs that just sets up the chapter to let your readers know what to expect for content and the order of the information that is presented. You pretty much just provide a summary of your study, and you restate what your research problem is, your purpose of your study, your theoretical framework, the research objectives or questions that you've used, and any hypotheses that you've tested, and then the methodology that you use to collect your data. This is usually very brief, 2 to 3 pages in length, and immediately follows your chapter overview. I would say this is optional for a lot of theses, and I see this more often in dissertations. I would check with your committee chair as to whether this is an expectation. The discussion of your findings or results presents conclusions drawn from the results of your data analysis. Findings from your study should provide the primary information for drawing conclusions. And frequently, your conclusions will provide answers to your research questions or objectives that you've posed in Chapter 1 and Chapter 3 and 4. Your conclusions are not the same as findings, and they're not simply just restating the findings from Chapter 4. A conclusion has to be broader and more encompassing than a specific finding, and several findings could be incorporated just into one conclusion. But with several findings, you may need to be used to support a conclusion. And it's also possible that one finding might give rise to several conclusions. You don't really present the results by restating statistics like the t-tests, the p-values, your statistical significance, or your effect sizes and things. It's not the technical details, but it's really just describing and restating what your questions are and the discussion of those findings. You have to be really careful when you're writing your research questions or objectives. You have designed your study to collect the data, and you've conducted the statistical analysis and wrote your results in text as well as in tables and graphs. But now, what does that mean? And explaining the meaning of the results to your reader is just the whole purpose of your discussion section. So although the discussion comes as the last chapter of your thesis or dissertation, you should be thinking about what you're going to write about in the discussion section from the moment the study is conceived. Questions that you'll develop in the discussion should be considered from the study's onset. Why is the study important? How does the study relate to previous studies? What are the limitations of the study's design? These are elements in a discussion that should be included and other things that should be avoided. And most importantly, you always have to write your discussion for the reader. The discussion is not a forum for you to impress others with your knowledge of the subject. You should be trying to convince the reader of the merits of the study's results. The discussion section of Chapter 5 can be organized in a lot of ways. Research questions or objectives are often used to organize this section in quantitative studies. In qualitative studies, some researchers will use those research questions, and others will use the variables or the themes to organize this section. You want to present your discussion in the same order as you presented the results chapter to help the reader connect information and have it flow and read better. There are 5 elements that you include in a discussion, and we will break down each one of these separately. First, you want to explain the meaning and importance of your results. No one has thought as long and as hard about your study as you have. As the person who conceived, designed, and conducted the study, the meaning of the results and their importance seem obvious to you. However, they might not be very clear for a person reading your paper for the first time. So one of the purposes of the discussion is to explain the meaning of the findings and why they are important, without appearing arrogant, condescending, or patronizing. After reading the discussion section, you want readers to think, wow, that makes perfect sense. Why haven't I thought of that? Even if your study's findings are provocative, you don't want to force the reader to go through the paper multiple times to figure out what it means. Most readers will not go to that effort, and your findings will be overlooked, discarded, or forgotten. Next, you want to discuss how your study relates to your framework. It may be that your study has a lot of major theoretical implications or conceptual framework implications. It may even confirm existing theory, or it could present disconfirming evidence. If it does, that's when you should call attention to these implications and relate what you learned from the study to the theory. Next, you want to relate the findings to similar studies. No study is so novel and with such a restricted focus that it has no relation to other previously published papers. The discussion section should just relate your study's findings to those of other studies. Questions raised by previous studies may have served as the motivation for your study. The results of these studies may support your findings, which strengthens the importance of your study's results. But when your findings differ from previous studies, that's important to also discuss and to perhaps explain why you think that is the case. Now you consider alternative explanations of your results. So despite efforts to remain really objective and to maintain equipoise, it's really easy just to consider only those explanations that fit your bias. And it's important to remember that the purpose of research is to discover and not to prove. It's really easy to just fall into a trap of designing a study to prove your bias rather than discover the truth. So when writing the discussion section, it's really important to carefully consider all your possible explanations for the study's results rather than just those that fit your biases. Be willing to explain unexpected results and how they might relate to your sampling strategy, the instrumentation, or even your research design. Next, you want to acknowledge your study's limitations. All studies have limitations. Study limitations can exist due to constraints on research design, methodology, materials, and these factors may impact the findings of your study. You need to acknowledge your study's limitations. All studies have limitations. Study limitations can exist due to constraints on the research design, your methodology, your materials, and these factors may impact the findings of your study. And it's far better for you to identify and acknowledge your study's limitations than to have them pointed out to you by committee members or a peer reviewer when you submit your research in a journal. You should clearly acknowledge any limitations in your research paper in order to show that readers that you're aware of these limitations and to explain how they affect your conclusions that can be drawn from your study's data. You have to be a critical thinker as you write your concluding remarks. You have to play the devil's advocate and put yourself in the shoes of your future readers. I'm going to cover a few things that we want to avoid when writing about our discussion of our findings. We want to avoid overrepresentation of the results, unwarranted speculation, inflation of the importance of your results, and the conclusions that are not supported by your data. We're going to break down each of these things to avoid. First, overrepresentation of results. It is easy to inflate the interpretation of your results. Be careful that your interpretation of the results does not go beyond what is supported by your data. Your data are the data, nothing more, nothing less. Unwarranted speculation. There's little room for speculation in your discussion. The discussion should remain focused on your data and the population and variables you studied. Inflate the importance of results. After the hard work that goes into a study, it's easy to attribute unwarranted importance to study findings. We all want our study to make an important contribution that will be cited for generations to come. However, unwarranted inflation of the importance of your study results will disgust reviewers and readers. A measure of humility goes a long way. Then your conclusions not supported by your data. The research questions or objectives, your data, and your conclusions should be a really tight package. You avoid the temptation to follow your biases to enter into the conclusions. All of your conclusions have to relate back to your data and answer your research questions or your research objectives. Let's move on to the next section of Chapter 5, which involves recommendations for practice and research. Your implications or recommendations for practice are generally prescriptive in nature and address what could or should be done by practitioners or members of your intended audience in terms of the professional practice and policy. And these recommendations are based upon the results of your study. Although a study can answer a lot of important questions, other questions related to the subject or topic may remain unanswered. Moreover, some unanswered questions may become more focused because of your study. You should make suggestions for future studies in Chapter 5. Recommendations for future study contain suggestions regarding follow-up studies or replication studies, and these recommendations usually acknowledge some limitations or delimitations that the study included and which further studies could help explain or clarify. These might include different methodologies, expanded populations or samples, or changes in the instrumentation itself. Thank you so much for joining me and learning more about what to include in your Chapter 5. If you have any questions, you can contact me through Canvas inbox.